I'd picture this. Los Angeles, California, 1906. A woman stands on a street corner in the rain, holding a newborn baby wrapped in a wool blanket. She has no umbrella. She has no plan. She has 43 cents in her coat pocket and a one-way train ticket that expired 3 days ago. Her husband is dead. She is 21 years old. And she is about to change the face of Christianity in North America forever. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. To understand what Aimee Semple McPherson became, you first have to understand what she was willing to lose. She was born Aimee Elizabeth Kennedy on October 9, 1890, on a farm outside Ingersoll, Ontario. The farmhouse sat at the edge of a frost-hardened field, and in the winters the wind came down from the north so hard it rattled the window frames loose. Her father, James Kennedy, was a quiet Methodist who kept his faith mostly to himself. Her mother, Mildred, was something else entirely. A Salvation Army officer who had given her daughter to God before the girl could walk, who prayed over her crib with the kind of urgency that most people reserve for emergency rooms. Aimee grew up between two worlds. During the day, she helped with the farm chores, fed the chickens, hauled water from the pump. But on Sunday mornings and Sunday evenings, and Wednesday nights, and any other night her mother could arrange it, she sat in the front pew of whatever meeting hall they could find, and listened to people preach about a God who healed the sick, who spoke in tongues of fire, who was not a distant figure in a stained glass window, but a living presence who showed up when called. She believed it, or she wanted to. There is a difference between those two things, and for a long time, Aimee lived inside that difference. By the time she was 17, she had begun to doubt. Not loudly. She had no audience for doubt on a farm outside Ingersoll, but quietly, in the way that young people doubt when they have read enough to know that smart people disagree about everything. She threw herself into school plays, into debates, into anything that felt like the opposite of a revival meeting. She was good at performing. She understood that a room could be held by the right voice, the right pause, the right moment of silence before the climax. What she did not yet understand was why. Then Robert Semple came to town. He was an Irish-born Pentecostal missionary, 21 years old, tall, with a way of speaking that made a room go completely still. He came to Ingersoll in the winter of 1907 to hold a series of revival meetings in a local hall, and Mildred brought her daughter to the first night and the second, and by the third night, Aimee had stopped arguing with herself. She did not fall in love with Robert Semple right away. She fell, first, with what he carried, something she later described as a weight, a presence in the room that she could not explain away. She had spent months building a skeptic's armor, and it came apart in a single evening. She knelt at the front of that drafty hall and wept for reasons she could not fully articulate. Only that it felt like something leaving her body and something entering to take its place. She also, within a few months, fell in love with Robert Semple. They were married in August 1908. She was 17, and he was 22. They had nothing, no savings, no property, no guaranteed income. What they had was a calling to China, which in 1908 meant a calling to one of the most dangerous missionary postings on earth. Mildred wept at the train station. Aimee held her mother's hands and told her not to worry. She did not know, yet, what worry looked like from the inside. They arrived in Hong Kong in the spring of 1910 after 6 weeks at sea. The heat was immediate and total, a different kind of heat than anything Aimee had known on the Ontario farm. Not just warmth but weight, something that sat on the chest and made the air feel used. They moved into a small mission house and began learning Cantonese and going door to door and holding small meetings in whatever they could find. Within weeks, both of them were sick. Malaria came for Robert first, then for Aimee. They lay in the same small room, burning with separate fevers, trying to pray through the fog of it. Robert rallied briefly. Then he did not. Robert Semple died in August 1910, 6 weeks after they arrived. He was 29 years old. Aimee was 19 and 8 months pregnant. She gave birth to their daughter, Roberta Starr, in the mission house, with a local midwife assisting, in a city where she barely spoke the language, in a country 10,000 kilometers from the Ontario farm where she had grown up. She had 43 cents. She had a train ticket that had expired. She had a baby who did not yet know what she had been born into. She booked passage home. On the ship back across the Pacific, she sat on the deck some nights after Roberta was asleep and watched the water and tried to find God in it. She did not, always. There were nights the water looked like nothing but water, vast and indifferent and cold. And she felt the full weight of what had happened, which was that she had given everything and been given catastrophe in return. She was 20 years old. Her husband was buried in a foreign city. Her mother was waiting in Canada. And somewhere underneath the grief, something she could not yet name was still burning. She went home to Ingersoll. She tried to rest. She tried for a brief period to be ordinary. It did not last. She met Harold McPherson in 1911, a salesman from Providence, Rhode Island, pleasant and steady and entirely unsuited to the life she was already, without quite admitting it, planning. They married in 1912. She moved to Providence. She had a son, Rolf. She set up a household. She cooked and cleaned and attended church and tried to want the life in front of her. The life in front of her felt like wearing someone else's shoes. The breaking point was not dramatic. It came quietly, the way real crises usually do, as a slow accumulation of wrongness, a growing sense that she was living at the wrong frequency. She began to preach again, at first at small meetings, then at larger ones. Harold did not understand this. Or rather, Harold understood it the way a man understands a weather system moving in, as something happening outside himself that he would have preferred not to deal with. The marriage did not survive the preaching. That is the simple version. The more complicated version is that Aimee had a choice to make, and she made it. And the cost was real, and she paid it anyway. By 1915, she was on the road with Roberta and Rolf, holding tent meetings up and down the eastern seaboard, driving a beat-up car she called the gospel car, painted with scripture verses on the sides, from town to town, with barely enough money to cover fuel and food. She slept in the car some nights. She ate crackers and canned beans. She preached in tents that leaked when it rained, to crowds that ranged from a handful of suspicious farmers to, increasingly, hundreds of people who had heard something about this woman from Ontario, who preached like the building was on fire. Because it felt that way when Aimee preached. Not like performance. She had done performance. She knew the difference. But like something moving through her that was not entirely her own. People came forward weeping. People stood up from wheelchairs. A deaf woman heard the organ music for the first time in 11 years and kept touching her own ears in disbelief, as if the body itself could not quite process what had changed. Aimee did not know what to do with these moments, exactly. She had not planned them. They kept happening anyway. What she did with them, eventually, was go to Los Angeles. She arrived in California in 1918, with nothing, again but with a different kind of nothing than before. Not the nothing of a girl who has lost everything, but the nothing of a woman who has chosen to hold nothing back. Los Angeles was the right city for what she was about to do. It was a city of arrivals, a city where people went when they had run out of other options and were ready to try something they had never tried before. The winters were mild and the summers were hot, and the land stretched out flat all the way to the mountains, and then the desert beyond. And there was a particular quality to the light in Southern California that made everything feel slightly more possible than it actually was. She began holding meetings wherever she could get space, in churches, and in rented halls, in the boxing arena downtown, in open fields when nothing else was available. She stood on a wooden platform and told the story she knew, the only story she had. The farm in Ontario, the young Irishman who came to town and carried something she could not explain, the ship across the Pacific, the small room in Hong Kong where her husband stopped breathing, the years on the road in the painted car. And people listened the way people listen when they recognize something true. They came in thousands, and then in tens of thousands, and she began to plan something she called Angelus Temple. The building she envisioned was enormous by the standards of 1921, a domed auditorium seating 5,300 people, with perfect sight lines to the stage with a broadcast booth for the radio transmitter she was already planning to install, with a prayer room that would operate 24 hours a day for people who needed it. She had no financial backing. She had no institutional support. She had a name that most respectable Christian organizations regarded with varying degrees of suspicion. She raised the money anyway, one offering plate at a time, one postcard campaign at a time, she mailed thousands of letters herself, sometimes sitting at the kitchen table until 2 in the morning, writing by hand when the typewriter ribbons ran out. On January 1, 1923, Angelus Temple opened its doors for the first time. By the end of that first Sunday, the waiting line stretched around the block. But here is the part they do not always tell you. Here is the thing behind the thing. Before every sermon, Aimee prayed alone. Not briefly, not a quick word before she walked to the platform, but for hours. She was known among the staff at Angelus Temple as the woman you could not reach between 6 in the morning and noon, because she was in her prayer room, and when she was in her prayer room, the world did not exist for her. She fasted regularly, sometimes for extended periods, and not for the reasons cynics would assume, not for the attention, not for the spectacle, but because she had come to understand, somewhere on the road between Providence and Los Angeles, that the power she carried was not hers to manufacture. It came from somewhere else. It could not be performed into existence, and it required a different kind of preparation than talent could provide. A staff member who worked at Angelus Temple for 2 decades described it this way. She would come out of that room and there was something different in her face. Not rested, exactly, not relaxed. More like emptied, like she had set something down that most of us carry without noticing. Then she would walk out to an auditorium of 5,000 people, and the temperature in the room would seem to change. This was not theater, or rather it was something that went so far past theater that theater is the wrong word entirely. Aimee understood theater. She had used it deliberately, staging dramatic illustrated sermons, with sets and costumes and lighting that newspapers called spectacular. But the distinction she drew privately, in letters and journal entries that survived her, was between the spectacle, which she designed, and the presence, which she did not. The spectacle drew the crowd, the presence was what happened when the crowd arrived, and the crowd arrived. 5,000 seats, 3 services a day, 7 days a week, a radio broadcast, KFSG, that reached across most of North America. Letters from Canada, from England, from Australia, from people who had listened on a cheap radio in a farmhouse kitchen, and felt something they had not expected to feel. People brought their sick on stretchers. They came from hundreds of miles away. A woman from Edmonton who had been told she had months to live arrived on a Tuesday afternoon and left walking without her cane. A man from Vancouver who had not spoken above a whisper for 6 years sang a hymn at full volume in the prayer room and could not stop laughing afterward. None of this was documented with the clinical rigor of a medical study. None of it was provable in the way that courts require proof. But the testimonies accumulated, hundreds, then thousands, and Aimee recorded them with the careful attention of someone who knew that what was happening was, in some form, historical. She was right. It was. And in 1926, she disappeared. She went for a swim at a beach near Santa Monica on May 18th and did not come back. For 5 weeks, she was gone. Her congregation held vigils on the beach. A diver drowned searching for her body in the water. The newspapers declared her dead. Mildred, now running much of the operations at Angelus Temple, held the organization together with sheer force of will, while privately, it was reported, she never stopped believing her daughter was alive. Aimee reappeared in Douglas, Arizona, on June 23rd, walking out of the desert. She said she had been kidnapped. The Los Angeles district attorney said the evidence suggested otherwise, that she had been with a man, a former radio operator at the station, that the entire disappearance had been staged, and that no kidnapping had taken place. The truth of what happened in those 5 weeks has never been definitively established. What is established is this: she was charged with criminal conspiracy and obstruction of justice. The charges were eventually dropped. The scandal did not destroy Angelus Temple, but it changed something in the public perception of Aimee Semple McPherson that never quite recovered. She went through a second divorce. She suffered what was described as a nervous breakdown. The newspapers, which had adored her, began to sharpen their coverage into something more like cruelty. And still, every Sunday morning, she walked out to 5,000 people. And still, something happened in that room that none of the journalists and none of the prosecutors and none of the critics had a satisfying explanation for. The last decade of her life was quieter, in the way that the sea is quieter after a storm has moved through. Not calm, exactly, but different. She spent the Second World War years throwing Angelus Temple's resources into relief work, feeding thousands of displaced and unemployed Angelenos who had nowhere else to go. During the Depression, her kitchen served tens of thousands of meals to people who had lost everything, not as a ministry program with a banner and a photograph opportunity, but as a simple, logistical response to the fact that people were hungry, and she had the means to feed them. She rarely talked about it. It was not material for a sermon. It was just what you did. She died on September 27, 1944, in her hotel room in Oakland, California. The cause of death was determined to be an accidental overdose of sleeping medication, barbiturates, prescribed for the insomnia that had plagued her for years. She was 53 years old. 50,000 people attended her memorial service. Let that number sit for a moment. 50,000. In 1944. In Los Angeles. Before social media, before the internet, before any of the mechanisms we now use to measure influence or reach. 50,000 people came to say goodbye to a woman who had been born on a frost-hardened farm outside Ingersoll, Ontario, who had crossed the Pacific at 19 with nothing but a calling, and lost her husband in a foreign city before she could say goodbye properly, who had driven a painted car from town to town, eating crackers and preaching in leaking tents, who had built a building that seated 5,000 with money she raised one letter at a time, who had survived scandal and legal charges and 2 divorces and a nervous breakdown, and still, every Sunday, walked out to the crowd and did the only thing she had ever really known how to do. She paid the price in rooms no one saw. God rewarded it in a room where 50,000 people ran out of tears. She left behind the International Church of the Foursquare Gospel, which she had founded in 1927. Today it operates in more than 150 countries, with millions of members. She left behind KFSG, one of the first religious radio stations in North America, which is still broadcasting. She left behind Roberta Starr, who went on to lead and question and eventually break with the institution her mother had built, because some inheritances are too complicated for simple gratitude. She left behind thousands of testimonies that the organization kept in filing cabinets and that researchers have been sorting through ever since. Handwritten letters from people who drove from Saskatchewan to Los Angeles in the middle of winter and drove home able to hear, or see, or walk, or breathe in ways they had not been able to breathe before, and she left behind something harder to categorize. A question that she never quite answered directly, which is how. How does a farm girl from Ontario with no theological training and no institutional backing and no financial resources build something that outlasts her by more than 80 years? She would have said she did not build it. She would have said she simply showed up every morning in a room alone and waited until whatever she was waiting for arrived and then walked out the door. That is not a satisfying answer. It is not meant to be. But if you are willing to sit with it, if you are willing to consider that the most significant things she did were done before anyone was watching, in a room no one photographed, in hours no one counted, then maybe the question changes. Maybe it is not how. Maybe it is whether you are willing to pay the same price, in your own woodshed, in your own secret place, and then walk out the door and see what follows you. If you are, you know what to do.